Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Nick Zulovich, Senior Editor of Subprime Auto Finance News and a part of the team at Cherokee Media Group. In today's webinar, are you asking the right appraisal questions? We're going to learn more from Jeff Reisner, who is the co-founder and Chief Executive Officer of the Appraisal Lane. But before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items for today's webinar. Please make sure you've dialed in using the phone number provided in your communication email, or you're able to listen via your PC speakers. We are recording today's webinar, and we'll make that recording available to you as soon as possible. You will be in listen-only mode for this webinar, and we will reserve some time after the presentation for a Q&A session. You could submit your questions at any time through the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel. And if we aren't able to get to your question today, don't worry, because we'll forward it on to the team at the Appraisal Lane so they can respond back to you directly via email. And lastly, if you have any difficulties during our webinar, please click on the hand icon to alert a member of our team. So with plenty of industry experience, let's get right to Jeff for our webinar. Jeff, the floor is now yours.
Nick, thank you for the introduction and facilitating this today. We appreciate the opportunity. And thank everybody listening for joining me. I thought I might start off with a little bit about my background to help you understand my perspective with some of the stuff I'll share with you today. I started detailing cars after school back in 1978, which that's actually kind of hard to say out loud. And suffice it to say, I'm pretty intimately familiar with how to pinstripe a Chevy Chevette. In the early 80s, my family got into the auction business, and I was instantly just fascinated. The event, kind of the Spice Bazaar, the marketplace, how vibrant it was. And I don't know, the best way to put it was I was really intrigued by the ability of somebody to drop off a truckload of cars and get instant either validation or not for what they thought the car was worth 3 to 5 days before. The ability that you could drop off a truckload of cars and walk away with a check. I spent a lot of time walking around the auction lanes talking to buyers and sellers, trying to understand what motivated people to pay what they did or to sell for whatever price they determined to liquidate the car at. What I came away with was there's one underlying theme, which is every car's worth what somebody's willing to pay. Fast forward to 1993, and I was very fortunate enough to be involved with a team started at Circuit City to found what became CarMax. And when I was first approached by Circuit City, I was taken aback by the fact that a big box retailer of consumer electronics was interested in getting in the car business. I just thought there's no way. At the end of my tenure with CarMax, I came away with a couple of really good lessons. Process is everything. If you're going to serve customers on a consistent basis, large volume, high dollar transactions, process is everything. Transparency, which in our industry through the 70s and 80s was quite frankly unheard of, resonates with the customer. It's what they're looking for. They just want to be part of the process. They want clarity and understanding and trust. The efficiencies that Circuit City brought to the car business were kind of unparalleled at the time, and I think they're still the gold standard in the industry. And data. Back when we first started CarMax, data was like the unknown frontier, and today there's an entire industry around it. I've spent the last 18 years consulting for franchise dealers, and one of the pressure points that we talk about on a consistent basis is trade valuation. And that process, how to deal with it, how to engage with the customer, and how to provide a consistent process across a company's entire organization. And what I would say is, too often we spend time thinking about how we've always done stuff, and we don't recognize the changes taking place around us. So today, we'd like to talk about how to identify what you're looking at. We'd like to define what's the most important things that you need to know about the car before you can accurately assess it. We'd like to help you define the questions that you need to ask and answer before you can bet your money. We'll go through the steps required that you need to go through in creating your process and understanding that no two used vehicles are alike. And finally, we'll talk about the need for a process and how to communicate it with your team and set it up so that it's executed consistently every day. Questions? Why is any of this relevant or important? You know, I think the one word that comes to mind is the internet. Back in the early 90s, the World Wide Web was released to the general public. This was a time when I was still handwriting my advertisements on a yellow legal pad and faxing them on a drum fax machine to the local newspaper. This was a time that when we rolled out the CarMax stores in Atlanta, we had an 8-page section of print in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Today, the buzzwords are SEOs, SEMs. There's actually an entire industry based around tracking online engagement, activity, users, interactions, VDPs or vehicle detail pages. Everybody's got a smartphone. The computing capacity in the average smartphone today is actually more powerful than the entire building of computers at NASA in 1969. With the mobile technology and the connectivity that we have with the consumers, it's more and more critical and more vital that we have transparency, consistency, and process. Consumers today have the ability right from their phone, sitting at the restaurant, sitting at the traffic light, or sitting at their desk, to shop and compare pricing across different dealerships in different areas and different states, nationally if they want to. This connectivity, this ability for them to do this anywhere, has made pricing transparency critical to getting customers to engage online. If you're $3,000 over the competition, nobody's going to reach out and touch you. Because of this visibility and this transparency on pricing, we have compressed margins on new vehicle transactions. And because of that, we have less wiggle room or opportunities for over-allowance on the trade valuation. This is why it's imperative that you have a good process that's connected, that gets you to an accurate valuation to mitigate any potential wholesale risk, or conversely, to make you miss the trade. When a customer comes in and connects either via email, text, an avatar on the website, or physically shows up at the dealership, they already have a pretty good idea of what they're willing to pay for the model they're looking at. And they also have a pretty good idea of what the dealer's willing to accept. But the last unexplored frontier in new vehicle transactions is trade valuation. What is my trade worth? That's the question. The first thing that we want to do is identify what we're looking at. At first blush, make, model, physical condition, trim, that's a really good start, but it's just part of the story. If it's 1 to 3 years old, are there any rebates or incentives on new cars? What's the engine type? Is it gas, diesel, electric? How about the physical condition? What's the local supply and demand? Who am I competing with? Am I in the right geography for this vehicle? Is there a stop sale on it? Are there any open recalls? This has become a big, big issue in recent times. What about the VHR? What about MSRP? Do I know what all the standard options are? In 2016, there were over 2,111 make, model, trim combinations. That's just mind-boggling to think about, where we were 20 years ago. And I don't think it's a realistic expectation that a used vehicle manager, a sales manager, a general manager, a used vehicle director for a platform be familiar with the entire breadth of the product that's available. But that doesn't change the fact that they're still going to get trades, they still have to value them, and they still have to bet your money properly. There are a lot of makes and models on the road today. Not all of them are still in production in the United States or at all. But they're still coming in on trade. They're still rolling across the curb. Hummer, Saturn, Pontiac, Saab, Suzuki. We've actually appraised some of those this week. How do you factor in parts, pricing for repairs? Can you sell them? Is there a limited market? What do? You still have to trade them. Let's take it up a notch. Take the 2,111 make, model, trim combinations and add in color. Are all colors equal? I don't think so. White is better in the south, not so good in the northeast. The darker colors are better up north, not so good in the south. Let's take it up another level and add interior color. A dark interior in the southeast or in the Sun Belt provides for hotter interior in the summer, but it's welcome in the winter up north. A light interior is more desirable down south. Let's just take it up another level. What about color combinations? White on tan is the gold standard. Navy on black or burgundy on black, not so much. That's the kiss of death down south, but not so much up north. Options. What are standard versus expected options? Well, let's take a sunroof in a luxury vehicle. 95% of the luxury vehicles out there come with a sunroof. They might not be standard, they might be an option that's added for on the MSRP, but the presumption is in the wholesale marketplace that it has it. So it's less about adding for the sunroof in the books and more about deducting if it doesn't have it, because you can't replace that car, you can't replace that sunroof, you can't add a factory installed OEM sunroof after the fact. Heated seats is another example. Really nice feature. It could be $300 to $500 or bundled with a $1,200 or $1,500 package. At the end of the day, if you've got a luxury vehicle in the Northeast or in the Midwest with no heated seats, you may deduct 2 to 3 times that because you can't remarket it up there. People just don't want it. And if you eliminate people from your buyer base and your addressable market, you've reduced the valuation when you go to remarket. What does technology package mean today? Well, 10 years ago, if it had navigation, there's a good chance that it had technology package. It's not navigation is not state of the art anymore. In reality, every smartphone that we talked about earlier has navigation. And most cars today come with Bluetooth so that you can actually use your navigation on your phone right through your sound system. Depending on OEM, navigation means different things. It could be sonar cruise control, heads-up display, lane departure, blind spot monitoring. I guess the bottom line is, if you don't know, don't guess. What you don't want to do is check that a vehicle has technology package if you're not sure. Because if you factor technology package into your valuation in a high dollar car, it's going to leave a mark when you go to remarket and it doesn't have it. Engine, transmission, key options. These are all things that you need to get intimately familiar with on the car that you're about to gamble money on. There are all kinds of options with engines, and some make models come with 3, 4, 5, 6 different options, and you don't want to guess here. There are some full-size trucks that have 3 different 8-cylinders that you can get in the car and a 6-cylinder. There are some sport utilities that come in a diesel now. I don't know if we have a large enough sample size to really gauge if that's an add or a deduct. Hybrids, they're great, but there's limited data. So there's a lot of guesswork involved in coming up with a valuation. Electric vehicles, there's a lot of questions there. Is it a plug-in? Does it have the equipment to plug in? Is the range good? We just don't know. We don't have enough data. So we have to really do our research and tap as many resources as we can before we bet our money. Transmission. Automatic's kind of the standard. Manual can be an add in sports cars and some highline and exotics. I'll share a story with you that can be kind of embarrassing, but it's really important to pay attention to transmission. I can remember probably 15 years ago buying a truckload of cars up at Manheim, Pennsylvania, and waiting for the truck to arrive back at the store. Having shared with the entire sales team my excitement at the deal I got on a Camry SE. It was fully loaded. It had leather, sunroof, wheels. It was the one, and I stole it. We were going to make big gross on it. Imagine my surprise when it rolls off the truck, and it's a stick. So I immediately went into backpedal mode, talking about the value, the fuel economy, the sporty handling, and how it was a great deal for the consumer. But I made an uninformed decision at the auction by not taking my time, not following process, and not paying attention to details. This only happened to me once. Key options. I think it's important to understand what options are supposed to be on the vehicle versus what it has. So when you're valuing the car and you're looking at all the market valuations in the books, do you have a middle of the road trim line and it's got lots of upgrades and it may outperform the market? Or do you have a highline car that's a little bit decontented, like the sunroof option we mentioned on a luxury vehicle? These are all factors when you're coming up with your baseline on how this car is going to perform relative to the market. VHRs. These are a fact of life. They've done a really good job creating a brand with the consumer. They've done a really good job in providing us data so that we can make informed decisions. I think it's important to pull both, and I'll tell you why. They don't all have 100% of the information, but in that knowledge gap, it can hurt. One missed frame damage announcement, salvage brand, flood, rebuilt, that could mean thousands in diminished value. The other thing I'll say is an accident indicator doesn't necessarily make a vehicle bad. All it does is limit or narrow the addressable market for that piece of inventory. The flip side is there's many dealers that look for these cars because they see value in them. They see the opportunity to advertise a reduced price and just come up with a really good process for disclosing and providing a transparent process on the value that is perceived by the consumer. Not all accident indicators are equal. You know, there's many different, there's minor with no damage, minor, normal, major, collision, sent to a collision facility, hit by an animal. We had one last week where it was hit by a moose, towed from the scene, airbag deployed. These are all things that some dealers will accept the first 2 or 3, but there's a major drop off after that, and you really get into limiting your market. And anytime you reduce your addressable market, you reduce your bidding pressure, and you reduce your opportunity to remarket that car for full value. The impact on valuation of a VHR accident indicator is really critical in the first 5 to 7 years that the model's in the age of the car. It's additionally critical in the first 100,000 miles. Luxury, rare vehicles, sports cars, highline cars, those are the ones that are impacted the most because there's not a big replacement set. When you discover that there's an accident indicator on a car, this should prompt you to look closer. What you want to gauge is there existing damage on the vehicle that matches with the vehicle history report? Or has it been repaired? And can you get a gauge on the quantity and quality of the prior repairs? This is really important when you go to remarket or when you're determining whether to keep the vehicle. The cost of a lazy appraisal is real. Historically, a bad appraisal, a mistake that gets represented or gets produced in the wholesale disposition of a vehicle would get washed out in the averages or in your wholesale line on the bottom of your statement at month end. It's just one number, one blip on the screen, one of a larger data set. But as we talked about earlier, with the compressed margins on new vehicle transactions today, it's imperative that we execute a process and pay attention to each and every one of those transactions. I'll share with you another anecdote, which when I was a young used car manager in Boone, North Carolina, I was appraising a car from the front porch of the used car building. A gentleman came in a 1988 Corolla SR5 coupe, which was pretty hot merchandise back in the day. It was dusk, the lights hadn't come on, it was starting to sleet, and it was cold, but it was warm inside. We sat down to write up the deal on the new car that he was looking for, and I stuck my head out, and the left side of the car looked great. It was shiny, it was wet, and there was nothing wrong with it. I put my head back in, wrote the deal, and imagine my surprise when I came back in the next day, and the whole right side of the car had been keyed. $800 in recon later to refinish and repaint the side of the car. I never made that mistake again. The difference in time to complete A good appraisal and a bad appraisal can be 5 to 10 minutes. Does saving that 5 minutes warrant the risks involved? I don't think so. It's imperative that you get up close and personal. You can't ever skip getting in that car. It doesn't matter how disgusting or dirty it might look or how nicely you're dressed that day. You've got to get in the car and check it out. Have you ever lost $1,500 or $2,000 on a trade? Have you ever lost $500 on a $500 trade? Well, once you start shipping and paying fees and disposition and something goes wrong on that car that you didn't do your close inspection of, that's easy to do. And for those of you that grinned or nodded your head, thank you for your honesty. How do you lessen the impact of these losers and stop the bloodletting? I'll tell you, do your homework, do your due diligence, and follow your process. You can't adequately inspect the mechanical condition of a car if you don't get in, turn it on, and listen. You're listening for knocks, pings, squeaky belts, anything that might give an indication that there's some issues with this car that might be greater than a lube oil and filter. Some issues are a couple $100, and an engine on a BMW could be $10 or $12 or $15,000. These are things that you don't want to gamble on. You can't replace putting the car in gear and making sure that it goes in drive and it goes in reverse. You can't replace taking 5 minutes and driving around the block just to make sure it shifts through all the gears. If it's a stick, you want to make sure that there's plenty of clutch left. You're talking about issues that could be $300 for a clutch or $3,500 for a transmission. Why gamble? Part of establishing a process is doing something the same way. Here's a suggested outline. Calling a car correctly on the exterior. I always like to start from the front driver's side and walk around the vehicle counterclockwise. I start here every single time. That way, when I'm reflecting back on the appraisal, I can remember what I did because I did the same thing every single time. I typically bend down and I look down the side of the car from the front and the side of the car from the back. I'm looking for waves, bondo, orange peel, anything that might give me a sense that maybe there were some prior repairs or some existing damage. There's also no shortcuts about just getting down on your hands and knees and looking under the car. If it's not in the shop, if it's not on a rack, you got to get dirty. You got to get up under and look for clamp marks to see if it's been on a frame machine. You're trying to look and see if there's anything structural, if it's jumped over a curb, and if there's any surface rust, particularly in the Midwest and the Northeast. You always want to take note of the tire and wheel condition. These can be costly items if you don't pay attention. Pop the hood. You want to check out and see if the radiator's good, if everything sounds good, and if everything's right where it's supposed to be. Also taking note, looking for tape lines or any signs of prior repair. And take a close look at the windshield because they can be costly as well. The process we find for the interior is similar. You want to open all the doors. You're checking for tape lines and making sure the door panels are in place and everything looks like it's supposed to. You're looking around for stains, burns in the carpet, the headliner, or the seats. You always want to turn on the ignition and check for lights. There's a reason those lights are there. They tell you if something's wrong. And if something's wrong, you might want to get an ODB sensor and plug it in, or have a mechanic check it out, or ask the customer. You always want to make sure and put your head in and check for any smells, such as smoke, pets, mildew, dampness. Always examine the trunk and the cargo compartment as well. Make sure that it's got a spare tire like it's supposed to, because those cost money too. Remember, when estimating recon costs, not all parts or repair costs are equal. A set of tires on a Corolla can be $350 and on a Corvette could be $2,500. A windshield on a Jeep could be $250 or $300 and on a Tesla could be $1,500. The key thing to remember is you need as much money, you need as much information as possible to accurately assess the value before you bet your money. The more information and the better communication with the customers regarding the factors involved with valuation, the better informed you're going to be. And I will say this, it's really important to engage with the customer. They own the car, they drive it every day, and if you ask it, you'd be surprised what they'll tell you. They'll share with you all sorts of information on things that are wrong or when their last service was, and that's really useful information when you're determining how much you want to put in the vehicle. Data sets. The good news is there's a ton of data out there. The bad news is there's a ton of data out there. And what do you do with that? Well, I hearken back to the days of going to the mailbox and getting the trifold with the market report from the previous 2 weeks, or probably the previous 4 weeks. Today, you can scan a VIN and pull a market report on a car from yesterday. It's real. We're connected. We're mobile. It's in the cloud. All this data is awesome, but it can also be confusing. If this is what you do all day, every day, you can get lost in the clutter and you can drown in the data. So I think it's real important to pick a process, pick the data sets that you like and that you're comfortable with, and that give you a consistent baseline when you're trying to execute trade valuation. I liken it to being in the dugout. You're playing in your Friday night softball league. You walk to the end of the dugout. You're going to the on-deck circle. There's a whole row of bats there, but you pick the one that you use every time, the one that you're comfortable with, the one that's the right length and the right weight. So that's what I would say with data sets. Pick the data set, pick the process, pick the technology that you're most comfortable with, and use it every single time. And you'll get a really good baseline, a really good benchmark, and you'll get much better. What do we infer from all this data? What are we looking for? Well, first of all, when we're looking at the data, I think we have to determine, is it valid? Is there a statistically significant cohort? Are there enough transactions of this particular make model in my region? There's a difference between a current model year Malibu where there's 150 of them in the Southeast, or a 7-year-old Maserati and there's 2 in the last 12 months across the entire country. What are the dates on the transactions? It's really important if you've got a smaller data set that you dig in and get granular. You want to look and see if it's October and you're looking at a Highline convertible, you want to look into the data, and when it says there's 6 transactions, make sure that they're not all from June and July. Because if they are, and they don't factor in seasonality into the algorithm that gives you the number, you've got to make your own determination on where that falls for you. So I think it's really important. Don't be afraid to dive into the data and get granular. As a matter of fact, I would encourage you to do that. If for no other reason, for a millisecond, you look at it and there's a huge data set, it makes you feel comfortable with what you're fixing to do. The other thing I'll say is if it's a current model year and you look and there's a huge data set and they're in factory sales, you have to ask yourself a couple questions. If it's in a factory sale, are there transportation or volume bonus rebates that are actually inflating the market price that maybe you're not eligible for because the car's at your doorstep and you're not going to get that? Also, are there any vehicles with exceptionally low miles that were perhaps sold on an MSO that qualified for new car incentives? This could be huge. I've been in factory sales where, we buy cars on MSOs and they qualify for $5,000 in incentives. So clearly we factor that into our bidding, which means that car's worth more to me than if it's got a title and it's 2 lanes over with 1,000 more miles on it. Is the data I'm looking at, or the algorithm, or the throughput, or the book value I'm looking at based on current supply and demand in my market? Is it based on supply of wholesale or retail? Is it based on my particular supply or demand? Is it based on the entire market? How does the market turn impact me? Is this brand something that I represent so I can outperform the market because I can CPO the car? Or is it an off-brand vehicle for me where I'm competing with somebody that can do that right across the street? These are all things that we have to factor in before we make a decision. I once, kind of back to the back analogy, I once came across an F&I manager and he had 2 sets of books and they're different colors. I think we can figure out what they were. And he had red ink on both of them. And one said domestic and one said Japanese import. And he would actually use a different book depending on what car he was looking at. And sometimes he would use a different book based on what he was sending the bank on selling the car and trying to get financed. And he'd use a different book for trade valuation. While that was creative back in the day, I don't think it's applicable today. Well, now we've looked at all the data sets. We've asked all our questions on what we can infer from the data. We've identified the car we've gotten. We've gotten up close and personal. What do we do now? Well, there's still some other factors to consider. Seasonality. Not all cars have a flatline depreciation schedule throughout the year. Convertibles go up in the spring, plateau in the summer, and go down in the fall. Four-wheel drives go up in the fall, stay strong in the winter, and start to dive off a little bit in the spring. Minivans typically get stronger in the spring and the summer. Geography. All those seasons, they're altered slightly depending on where you're at. Is this vehicle susceptible to seasons? I think we would all agree yes. The geographical factors. Would a snowbird resident in Florida who drove south for the winter want to trade their four-wheel drive in Florida, or would they see more value if they waited until they were back in Maine? So now that we've done our homework, factored everything in, what do we have? I think that's the big question. At the beginning of the value process, before we actually put a number on a car, we have to ask ourselves this. Does this vehicle meet my stocking plan for whatever reason, whether it's condition, age, miles, or my current supply? That's a simple yes or no. It meets my stocking plan or it doesn't. One thing I can say about this part of the equation is we should never let our desire to make a deal or hold gross impact the answer. When going through all the data, tools, guides, and services, we'll typically come back with one market value. And let's say that number is $12,000. If you answered yes, this car meets my stocking plan, then it's probably worth $12,500 or $6,000 because you don't have shipping, acquisition fees, post-sale inspection, somebody out of the store to buy it. It's right there. And you've narrowed the region of darkness because you had time to adequately inspect the car and determine what you have. You're also sitting there across the desk from the person that owns it and drives it, and you can get whatever information you need to from them. So it should give you a higher confidence level to bet that value. If you answered no, then you should probably back up anywhere from $400 to $600 because you're going to have disposition expenses. You're going to have risk. You're going to have timing. You're going to have carrying costs. You're going to have depreciation. You might have to pay somebody to be out of the store for the day to go represent the car. Where we typically run off the road is when we answer no, but we put a yes valuation on a car. This does several things. It overstates the margin on the current deal. And it sets us up to play the odds that we can beat the system. Growing up in the car business, I came to realize we make a lot of decisions, or historically have, based on the exception, not the rule. So if you've determined that this car doesn't meet your stocking plan, but you bet money that it does, you're playing the odds. You've put too much money in a car based on the odds that you can retail your way out of the mistake. You've now got a piece of inventory with a low probability of sale and a high probability that it's going to become an aged piece of inventory. It's going to experience additional reconditioning costs, additional depreciation, and interest and carrying costs on that car. You've pretty much guaranteed yourself for a wholesale loss in 60 to 90 days. Has anybody on the call ever stretched on a trade? This is a common phrase in our industry. Basically, stretching on a trade means you're putting a value on a car that you absolutely know is incorrect. You know it's too much, but you can't pass this deal. It's the end of the month. You need it for a bonus. You need it for the next OEM stair-step level to get that huge, huge pile of cash. These are all not the correct reasons to overvalue a trade. The next iteration of that is, have you ever stretched on a trade, put it through the shop, and then 3 days later suddenly gotten amnesia on the fact that you stretched on the trade and priced it like you normally would if you bought the car for fair market value? This is when we fall into the trap of let's roll the dice, or we fall into the ego trap where we start to believe our number, even though at the time we put it on, we were cringing because we thought we were putting too much on it, but we were willing to roll the dice. If you ignore the data and your stocking plan, you should at least be aware of it and make an informed decision. It's always good to have a baseline, and if you're stretching to make a deal and you stretch on the trade, price it correctly, take your thin margin, turn the inventory, and let the vehicle go down the road. It's better to do that than to blow it off as some cars just don't retail. You should own your process so that you can own your inventory right. In conclusion, I would say appraisal methodology is not one size fits all. There is no one answer. There's a lot of different technologies out there. There's a lot of data sets. There's a lot of valuations and guides. Everybody has to pick the tool that's right for them. You should choose the system that works best for you and your team and get everybody on the same page. So regardless of who's on staff, regardless of what time of day it is or what day of the week it is, you execute the same way. This all starts with establishing a process. Execute it each and every time, regardless of the type of car, the value of the car, the time of day, or the weather. It's important to have a process. It's important to involve your team in the process, because without a process, you can't measure performance. And if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Always know what you're looking at. And if you don't know, don't guess. You have a great resource right there at the dealership, looking at the car with you. It's their car. Ask them about it. They'll tell you everything you want to know. Follow your process every time. Nick, I'll turn it back over to you if there's any questions.
And great presentation, Jeff. Thank you so much for the great life experiences and insights into how best to appraise that potential trade that comes into your dealership lot. And if you have questions for Jeff Reisner, who's the co-founder and chief executive officer of the Appraisal Lane, please use the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to these great questions that have come in. And just a reminder that we are recording this session, so keep watch of your inbox for a link to the recording so you can go through the great material that Jeff has shared and share it with other teammates at your store. And one of the first questions that's come in, Jeff, came in about the time when you were touching on vehicle history reports and how crucial those data points can be. What's your assessment of taking on vehicles that were rental vehicles in a past life? What's your assessment of the conditions and the history of a vehicle that's been in a rental fleet previously? What have you suggested as to how stores handle those type of units?
I would say on the rental cars, the key thing there is really about options and content. Most of the rental fleets today have really good service history and really good service process. So as long as you can physically inspect the car, you've got a great car. It's easy to CPO. The one thing to understand is there's a lot of them. So anytime there's an increased supply of something like that, particularly in a region where they're cycling their fleet, I think it's important to factor that in and make sure you get a sharp buy and then price it accordingly. When we typically consult with franchise stores and they're buying a package of rental cars, we encourage them to price them aggressively and price them to turn and look for incremental sales. But they're a great value for sure.
That's Jeff Reisner, who's the co-founder and chief executive officer of the Appraisal Lane, special guest here for our webinar that's titled, "Are You Asking the Right Appraisal Questions?" And we're talking about trades and other vehicles that might come up on your lot. And during the closing portion of your presentation, Jeff, describing what happens at month's end sometimes certainly appears to have resonated with some of the individuals who have joined us here today. Just again, stretching the trade to make those month-end objectives. Just again, how tempting is it to go down that road, so to speak? And what advice have you shared in hopes that that practice perhaps is curtailed or avoided to make sure those pitfalls 60 to 90 days down the road don't appear?
You know, we've actually worked with, in my past life, I worked with some franchise stores on changing their pay plan so that there wasn't quite the same level of incentive to overstate gross and then overstate your position in the inventory. When you come up on month end and you're really trying to tag those deals, you just still have to be realistic. So if that's a $12,000 car and you put 12.5 in it, you can't put 13.5 in it and show a $2,000 gross on the car you just sold. You need to put the 12.5 in it and show $1,000 gross, and you took a thin margin, but you created a deal and a transaction at the end of the month. So, you know, I guess, you know, it's good to at least attempt to be agnostic and have your loyalty be to the value of the asset and not any of the stuff that's going around it, because your needs, wants, or desires around, you know, performance of the store don't make that car worth $1 more in the wholesale marketplace.
Again, our special guest for our webinar today is Jeff Reisner, who's the co-founder and chief executive officer of the Appraisal Lane. And just a reminder that we are recording today's session, and so keep watch of your inbox for a link to that recording so you can go through the great presentation again or share it with others at your store. And if you do have a question for Jeff, please use the questions box on the control panel to share yours. And another one that's come in, Jeff, and it's an interesting one to say the least, in light of making appraisals. As you well know, several stores nowadays are switching to the one price model system as opposed to having some negotiation between the store and the customer happening. Complicated to say the least, but how do you adjust appraisals if in fact the store has a one price model versus one that still has some negotiation in play?
Well, I tell you, we actually have customers, you know, both in a traditional negotiated model and in a negotiation free or one price model. And really the valuation methodology, the inspection process, the engagement with the consumer is has the potential at least to be exactly the same. Gathering the information, involving the customer in the process, giving them the ability to be part of the process and therefore feel like they're part of the answer. You can't really put a value on that. As far as when you come up with the number, if it's a negotiated model, you may come up with the number for your ACV, but you may present something slightly less or something slightly more depending on how you're structuring your deal. Typically with our one price stores, they just turn the phone over and show them the number. And that's how they structure it. It's kind of third-party validation. But certainly the intelligence gathering, what you infer from your data set, all the research that you do, that process is exactly the same. The only thing that might change is your interaction with the customer at the end of it.
Closing moments here with our special guest for our webinar, Jeff Reisner, who's the co-founder and chief executive officer of the Appraisal Lane, talking about evaluating trades and other vehicles that might arrive at your lot to make sure that the deals are structured properly. And in our closing moments here, Jeff, we're certainly into the meat of the fourth quarter of the year. What would be your advice as far as how quickly some changes in the appraisal process can be made at a dealership? If a store wants to start from scratch, so to speak, or maybe tweak some of their processes, how quickly can the changes be made, and how much time should the store manager allow to see if the changes that they're making, what kind of impact they've had?
Well, I think one of the things that you really want in today's environment is consistency. And, you know, that's hard to execute without process. So I think step one is, you know, grab your management team and sit down and figure out what the resources are and figure out step by step how you want to execute the appraisal process. Whether it's engaging with the customer or it's doing off to the side independently, you still need to follow the same steps and the same process. And you can't do that if you don't have the recipe. Everybody's got to be on the same page, so it doesn't matter which manager's on shift, and what data sets or what resources they have access to. So, I think it's as easy as setting up a process and starting to execute it and then tweak it, and make it iterative so that you continually improve the process till you get it where it fits right for you and your store.
Very good, very good. Well, one more, we'll squeeze one more question in here. Again, talking about the different potential histories of vehicles that might be out there in the wholesale space. Just again, how can a used car manager, whether it's at the auction, just whether it's in a high fleet environment or perhaps a repossession, if they make a purchase out of that lane at the auction, just again, how much do they need to watch that vehicle history and consider that when making their evaluation?
Well, I mean, I think what's critical with the vehicle histories is if you tab into the details page, it just gives you a wealth of information. You know where that car was born. If you're looking at a car down in Atlanta and it was born in Chicago and spent the first 5 years in Illinois, it may have some salt and corrosion up underneath it. If it was in taxi livery use, which definitely impacts the value of the car because it's something that needs to be disclosed to the end user. It's just, here again, it's all information that colors what you do with your data. So you have to be aware of it. You have to be aware of anything that's in the vehicle history report that might eliminate part of your potential market, because if it reduces the demand, it's going to reduce your ability to turn it for a premium in a timely manner. So it's just all information, and there's kind of no bad information in there. It's just what you do with it, I guess, is where you might get into trouble.
That's Jeff Reisner, who's the co-founder and chief executive officer of the Appraisal Lane. A lot of great information and recommendations, Jeff. Thank you so much for sharing a lot of great best practices to help stores of all sizes.
Well, good deal. Well, I thank you for your time and just appreciate the opportunity to share some perspectives and some thoughts and hopefully spark a few conversations.
Well, thank you so very much for joining us. Again, please keep watch of your inbox for a link to the recording of our session. So all the best for continued success at your store, and we look forward to having you again next time.